Rose Coffee Room. Wild Rose Coffee Room is a joint presentation between the Economic Education Association of Alberta and the Wild Rose Loyalty Coalition. I'm Danny Hozak, Chairman of the Economic Education Association and President of the Wild Rose Loyalty Coalition. Our first guest tonight is John Robson. He's the Executive Director of the Climate Discussion Nexus, a documentary filmmaker, a National Post, Epoch Times, and Loonie politics columnist, and a contributing editor to the Dorchester Review. Yeah, he's worked in academia, think tanks, and politics, as well as doing print, radio, television, and online journalism in Canada. I think it's fair to say that had our political elites taken advice from John, we wouldn't be in the crisis that we're in at this moment. But having said that, I was talking to John earlier, and I said I trust you won't bother saying I told you so as you get talking. But John has been, I didn't mention, but John has been a big part of our Economic Education Association, both as a planner and as a presenter over the years. I think we had our first Freedom Talk conference in about 2014, and we've had 15 or 18 conferences in the ensuing years. John has been a big part of that, and we have consistently and persistently tried to discuss controversial issues that our political elites have been hesitant to even think about, let alone talk about. And what we as an economic education, pride ourselves in doing is looking at the issues, looking at the pros and cons of the different issues, and then trying to come up with and having a respectful discussion about them. And I think it was our friend Preston Manning who said leading up to the last federal election that a Mark Carney election could actually be the last election in a united country. And when you look at the reaction to Mark Carney's election in Alberta, it certainly seems like that could possibly be right. Ontario professor Bruce Pardy has also been traveling and speaking in Alberta and advising us in Alberta that we should in fact be considering independence, not like to save ourselves, nothing to do with Canada, but we should save ourselves. We should be a separate country, and he maintains that may even shake up the rest of Canada, where it actually an event forces them to save themselves. But having said that, we've got uh, we've got we've got John here tonight, and like I say, he's been a wealth of he spent his life studying these issues, giving advice to in both in academia, writing in the National Post, and being a big part of our freedom conferences. And so, John, I guess the issue tonight. Welcome, John. If can we bring it, John? Thanks for joining us,
I'm
John. I
here.
realize it's later in Ontario than it is here, but thanks for being here with us. I mean, so essentially, what's going on in Alberta, and what's going on in Alberta is the election of Mark Carney has sort of relit the smoldering flames of independence, and we're in some people are in full blown let's get out of here mode, and yet. I think one of the things that we as a economic group have consistently done is tried to take in a sort of an impassionate, look at what the options are, what the pitfalls are, and so why don't we start out by you sort of sharing your thoughts on where we're at, and we'll have maybe your sort of an initial advice, particularly for Alberta. Like, what do you think we should be doing? What are some of the pitfalls we certainly will come up against? What are some of the opportunities? What are the challenges? Go ahead, welcome, and where do you think we're at with this?
Well, for starters, I think that in Ontario it is later than the government believes that it is. I think that a number of issues in this country are much more urgent than the conventional wisdom would have you believe, including, of course, the issue of Alberta alienation, also the issue of getting the budget under control. There's a line I like to quote from the late Rudy Dornbush, an economist, who said, basically in economics, things take longer to happen than you believe they could, and then they happen faster than you thought was possible. And if you wait until you're in a crisis where interest is eating up spending, interest rates are rising, debt servicing is crowding up programs, this is something you should have prevented before you got there. And the same is true of regional alienation. You don't have to believe that every single thing that every irritated person in Alberta says is bang on to understand that the West in general and Alberta in particular have been treated badly by central Canada. That a number of policies that were in the national interest were bad for the West, sometimes accidentally, sometimes more or less deliberately. And that if you wait until there's a referendum with support rising above 40%, you are dealing with a problem you could have prevented if you had acted more sensibly and in a more adult way sooner. You told me not to say I told you so, so I won't say I told you so. But for instance, I just noticed that I wrote a column in the National Post 10 years ago, in 2015, saying we needed to double military spending. And at the time, this was the opinion of obviously of a raving lunatic. And now suddenly Mark Carney is saying that from well under 2% of GDP on defense, we're going to get to 5% right away. 150 billion a year on defense. And where is he going to find that money? Nobody knows. So yes, had they ramped up defense spending years ago, they wouldn't be in the crisis they are now, where they're overspending on other things is crowding out even existing defense spending at a time when they are actually looking to triple it. And again, with Alberta separatism, I have commented in the past periodically that Canada strikes me as proof that people don't want to be happy. Because there cannot surely be a country on this planet that is more fortunate in terms of its location, its resource endowment, its history, its benevolent superpower neighbor, its cultural capital, its tradition of voluntarism, its successful implementation of a small government model of prosperity and human flourishing. And what are we doing? We're throwing it away. We adopt every bad policy we can possibly think of. And to me, this is one of the most critical points. We insist that there's only one reputable opinion on any subject, and it's the one that involves sleepwalking into disaster. Take the Canada Health Act, obviously catastrophic, both financially and for the health of Canadians. And yet not even the right-wing parties, so-called, will challenge it. And with Alberta separation, if you wanted to stop this, if you were a Central Canadian determined to hold the country together, what would you do? You would have an adult discussion of why Albertans were unhappy. You'd ask, amongst their grievances, which ones can we say are probably exaggerated? Which ones do we have to admit are very legitimate? And how do we address those ones so that they and we end up better off? And that's the one thing they're not going to do.
Well, exactly. And I mean, like the one main thing that Carney keeps talking about is this carbon net zero. I mean, and as you know, like, I mean, your whole climate discussion nexus is pointing out, the benefits of more CO2, the benefits of our energy industry. And yet, Eastern Canada seems to be quite happy, asking us for more and more money while trying to tie our hands behind our back as far as the development of our resources. And it's at what point in time do we say, okay, we've got the resources, we don't need you, we're leaving? Like, I mean, they just don't seem to get the message, do they?
Well, they don't. And it's funny. I saw a comment from somebody I used to work with at the Ottawa Citizen, who was a columnist who was so far left that she and I were in agreement that the mushy middle wasn't getting it done. And we disagreed on almost everything of substance, but there was a similarity of outlook. And she was saying that decarbonized oil is like desalinated salt. And this whole idea that, yeah, you know what, we can keep producing oil because that way the West will be happy, but we can have oil that doesn't give off carbon. You don't understand the chemistry of combustion if you think that, right? Why are carbohydrates energy efficient? Because you burn them and they give off water and CO2, and breaking up the chemical bonds of the more complex molecules releases a lot of energy. And so Mark Carney has this very typical Laurentian talent of talking out of both sides of his mouth and saying nothing out of either. And when you listen to him, he's not really giving you policy options. He's giving you soothing verbiage that conceals what he's thinking and what he might be going to do. And therefore, again, you get this sense that you can't really grapple with it. Does Mark Carney believe or not believe that Canada must get to net zero promptly? You'd think he does, right? In his last 20 years of his career, this seemed to be a constant theme. And yet now he talks about us becoming a conventional and alternative energy superpower. And then a phrase like an alternative energy superpower, that sounds good, right? That's grammatically a coherent sentence. It's got lots of nice long words in it that we sort of approve of. But it doesn't mean anything. The idea that we are going to become, I don't know what, like a giant exporter of solar energy to the world, when solar is too inefficient, the footprint's too big, the storage problems are overwhelming, the cost is too high. It doesn't actually mean anything. And what we need now is meaning. We need someone to say, yes, we're going to develop Alberta's hydrocarbon resources. We are not going to get to net zero. It wouldn't matter if we did. And if they like, they could throw in, and by the way, there is no man made climate crisis. Or else they could say, well, there is, but we can't stop it. I mean, I take something that, with intellectual content, or else you could say, no, we're going to do this net zero thing. We're going to shut down Alberta's energy industry. You're all going to be a lot poorer, but so will everybody else. And we just have to live with it because otherwise the planet goes crackle, crackle, whoosh. And you could say either of those things and we could have a debate. But this is one of the things that, in a strange way, they're so solemn and pompous, but they're so childish. They will not talk about things like, again, to go back to the Canada Health Act. The Canada Health Act creates bad incentives. It's why, despite spending more than almost any other advanced country of our GDP on health, we have outcomes that are worse than almost anybody's. But you can't even say that. People go, oh, our healthcare system's the envy of the world. And if you put up your hand and say, excuse me, what country has ever imitated us? They just all kind of move away from you there on the bench. I don't just mean the politicians. I mean the pundits, the kind of people who get to go on CTV or CBC television programs, not that anybody's watching. They just won't act like grown-ups. Grown-ups talk about real problems. Grown-ups talk about real alternatives. Grown-ups don't pretend everything is fine. Grown-ups don't pretend they have magical powers. I mean, again, remember Mark Carney was running elbows up. I'm going to clobber Donald Trump. Well, of course, in fact, he's gone and groveled before Donald Trump, and that hasn't worked very well either. But if he'd run and said, look, Donald Trump is hard to manage. I don't think I can do it. I don't think Pierre Poilievre can do it, really. But we're going to do the best we can for our country and attempt to ride out the storm. That would have been a grown-up thing to say, whether voters would have liked it or not. But he didn't. He told us instead that he was going to go and clobber Trump. And he didn't even try. That wasn't even, I mean, it barely rises to the level of being false. And we get so much of that. It's, oh, yeah, we're going to, everybody's going to cut 15% from their departments. I mean, if I had a nickel for every politician who'd waged a ruthless war on waste, as opposed to looking at the budget and saying there are some things here that the government either can't do or could do but shouldn't, and we're going to stop doing them. They never do that. They always say we're not going to cut transfers to people or to provinces. Well, that's where the money goes. How on earth do you intend to get spending under control if you won't stop handing out free money, which is the main thing the state does these days? It's just silly. And yet what we get is silly. We never get serious. We don't get politicians, and I'm going to say, even, let's knock everybody and make them all hate us. But Danielle Smith, and I've actually had this discussion with her in person, she will not challenge the notion that there's a man-made climate crisis. And the argument, as far as I can see, is not that she doesn't think it or not think it. It's that we lost that debate. And of course, we didn't lose it. We never had it. But if people had a discussion and they reached the wrong conclusion, and now it matters, why don't we go back and revisit the error? Like, what on earth is wrong with people or a political system where if they get something wrong, they can't go back and try again? That's idiotic. Try again, of course, but don't go on to the point where you're being an idiot. If you keep trying something and it doesn't work, admit that it's a bad approach. Why can't we combine perseverance with sober second thought? Why can't our political system deal in a grown-up way with all kinds of issues? I mean, I'm coming back to this $150 billion a year on defense, which I think we need, by the way, though we'll spend it badly. Where are we going to get that money? There are only a couple of ways you can do that. You can borrow it, you can raise it in taxes, you can print it, you can cut in other areas. And when people look at it, they don't say, okay, even we'll do a quarter in each area, right? We're going to go 37.5 in each of those areas. They talk in soothing generalities that mean nothing. And we know, among other things, trying to deal with the fact that American policy has become somewhat unpredictable, that Canada needs to have a more productive economy. We need to have more investment. We need to have better. We need to have more output per worker so people can get paid more. And that means we can't raise taxes. We have to lower taxes. We have to fix our tax system. We have to flatten it. There's all kinds. We have to get rid of all those loopholes. Which again, Stephen Harper is a villain in this part of the story. We must stop bringing in temporary foreign workers who aren't allowed to come here and build a better life for themselves, but do take away jobs from Canadians and drive down wages. It's preposterous that we have millions of people in this country. And if you go around, when I travel, you see this in hotels and restaurants and all that. You see all kinds of people who are here as something not unlike slave labor. They're being poorly paid, and when we're done with them, it's out you go. It's not, hey, welcome to Canada, work hard, save money. One day you'll have a place in our country. They're temporary foreign workers. They don't get to stay. But in the meantime, drive a teenager finding work. We do almost everything you wouldn't want to do. And yet, if you try to criticize it, the result isn't even that people argue with you, they sneer at you. And I think at some point it would be a much better idea if it were agreed that we could have a debate. Is there a man made climate crisis? Why do we think there is? What's the evidence in favor? And if you're somebody who thinks we do have that kind of a crisis, if you look at Justin Trudeau, even a Mark Carney, could you please tell us, show us that your brain is engaged with the subject? Why might a reasonable person, intelligent, well-informed, and well-meaning, why might they disagree with you? You're allowed to think they're wrong, but can you tell me why somebody might hold an opinion different from yours? Because one of the things, and this is by no means just the left, but since they're in power, they tend to get the focus of my ire on this one. There's very little agreement in this country nowadays that people can disagree without being fools, knaves, or both. And I think that's one of the critical things we have to get over. We have to realize that while there is one right answer to any question, it isn't always obvious. And the people who disagree with us are not ideologues, they are not villains. And some of them possibly are villains, but that's just life. Some of the people on our side are probably villains. But what we need to come to grips with is the ideas. We need to say to ourselves, why do we believe that lower taxes or higher taxes would be good for the economy? What's the line of reasoning and what's the counter argument? Because I see too where the public sector unions are saying, oh, if Carney cuts public sector employment, it'll be the end of the world. We'll stop getting good service. And I would like somebody to say, no, it's not obvious that we're getting good service from government these days. It isn't entirely clear that if you get a letter from the Canada Revenue Agency and you don't understand it and you phone them, they'll even pick up the phone. And if they do pick up the phone, it's far from clear that you will ever get to a person who's able to understand your problem, explain it to you, and either admit that in fact they're in error or else clarify for you why they're right. So this is not adult conversation, especially again, you know how much the public service expanded under Justin Trudeau. The notion that it can't go back halfway to where it was a decade ago without the world ending is not a grown-up idea. I gather they don't want their members to lose their jobs, fair enough, but to try and pretend to us that there'd be an existential disaster when Canada's government is already so incompetent that it can't even give away money anymore. I think it was the Canada Investment Bank. There's some bank with these fancy ideals and a huge budget, and they couldn't even hand out the money to bad projects. Things are so terrible in our government that it's not intelligent to have public debate paralyzed. Or again, supply management. There's a classic one. First thing we're going to do, we're going to get the economy efficient. We're going to remove internal trade barriers. Yeah, we're neoliberals. Hooray, we'll be prosperous. We'll show those Americans. Next, no, supply management is off the table in trade talks. And not even the conservatives are willing to challenge this. And so again, we have this monolithic discussion that's also moronic. And that's bad. That's not how to do it.
Well, yeah, and the problem with that, and like Kevin Abram, as you know, was one of the original founders of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and he said, and I think it was true, but he said Alberta actually became an NDP province long before they elected Rachel Notley. And the reason they did was we went from 1967, when Lougheed got elected, till 2012, when the only opposition was to the was to the left of the government. Like all the opposition was to the left. And when I'm talking about this, like if you remember when Stephen Harper got elected, one of the things that he did that I agreed with was he came out with that $200 per child, credit to the mother. So a mother of three was getting $600 a month for her three young kids. Well, in the next provincial election, one of the issues was daycare. And Ed Stelmach, bless his heart, came along with one of his big daily announcements was 29,000 publicly funded daycare positions. And I phoned our MLA at the time, Lloyd Snellgrove, and I said, Lloyd, like publicly funded daycare is a socialist idea. It's not a conservative idea. Like what you should have done was match the $200 so that the mother at home was getting $1,200. You know what I mean? But the reason I'm making this point is one of the reasons that we need an economic association, one of the reasons we need the Wild Rose Loyalty Coalition is we need some opposition out to the right of the government. As you know, we've all seen many of well-intentioned people, go to be our MLA or our MP and say, oh yeah, like I don't believe in the climate hoax. I don't believe in, I don't believe in the vaccines. I don't believe in a whole host of things. And then they get there and they say, well, why aren't you speaking out? Well, I can't say that or I'm off message. You know what I mean? And so they're not even allowed to debate these issues, like you say. Even if they could say, well, look, let's have an open and honest debate about it, and we'll see what the people want. But we're not even allowed to have the discussion at this point in time, are we?
No, and again, I find this with politicians, it's a very odd thing that seems to happen to them because most conservative politicians went into politics because they had fairly right wing views, but they immediately get drawn into that, oh, I can't go off message. And one of the things I want to tell them is look, life is short. You've been handed an opportunity. It may not last very long, right? You may serve one term, whether you're obsequious or whether you're outspoken. But what do you want them to remember you by? Do you want people, when you're done with your time in office or you have passed away, to say, yeah, he conformed in order to avoid irritating the leader? Or do you want people to say, that woman said what she believed and was willing to take the heat for her convictions? Who do you want to be? And there's lots of other things. As I've said many times, the one place I'd like to see government spend more, one of the few, they ought to give legislators more staff because both at the provincial and the federal level, MPs, MLAs, and so on do not have enough research staff to enable them confidently to challenge the leader's office. If you go along with the leader and say something absolutely preposterous, they'll protect you. But if you go out on your own, then they'll hang you out to dry. But what are you there for? Why did you go into politics if it wasn't finally to see somebody with a backbone do something about our problems? And if you're an outspoken, principled conservative and you lose your seat, you will find some rewarding way to make a living and people will admire you and they will like you. But if you're a spineless time server, well, I don't know, maybe you get to become a lobbyist after that. But it's so strange how quickly that happens to so many people. And then when they're no longer in office, they will say, "Oh, gee, I wish I'd said something." And I'm saying, "Well, say something now. Seize the day, make use of this moment. You have a microphone, you have people's attention, and if you get kicked out of your caucus for it, fine. Be a proud independent. Um,
Yeah,
make it
yeah,
mean something
yeah.
while you can."
You're absolutely right. Like Brad Wall, bless him, spoke in at the Lloydminster Cattlemen's Grill, 6 months after he stopped being premier, and he played a little clip of, his favorite movie, which was, Wyatt Earp at some showdown, and I think the younger Earp had got shot, or maybe it was the older one, and the other Earp was holding him, and as he was dying, he said, "Don't let them do to you what they did to me." And but he was talking about like the beef industry saying like don't let them do to you what they did to the oil industry about CO2 and one thing and another. And I thought, like, are you kidding me? Like you've been the premier of the province for 10 years and now you're coming out here with some advice saying be sure you stand up for the beef industry. Like what happened in the 10 years you were there? You could have stood up for it. We could have worked together on a whole host of these things. I To change the subject a little bit, but you've mentioned the Canada Health Act and how it's almost like the Holy Grail. And I was talking, Bruce Party is talking about that, and he said like you really can't, like if you're going to have a new country, like you might as well get rid of publicly funded healthcare. And I thought, well, okay, like we our Wild Rose Party has long said, private delivery publicly funded. But have you given any thought? This is a complete change of the what we're talking about. But how do you go from a public healthcare system to a private healthcare system? Like, I mean, surely it would take 5 or 10 years, wouldn't it? I mean, I can see how you go to private delivery and public pay, but how do you go to a completely private system, or is that irrational, or is it something that we should be looking at as a new country, or what do you think on that topic?
I think that the most critical step here, and again, that it's such low hanging fruit, you repeal the ban on private insurance for medical procedures that are covered publicly. That is the very first thing that you do. And that way, people can get protection at a reasonable rate. I mean, as you know, I'm very much a minimal government person. I think in a country as wealthy as Canada, if there were not a public healthcare system of any meaningful sort, and if your provincial taxes were cut by, say, 40%, but you were told, okay, look, from now on, it's time you got together with your fellows to create charitable options for those people who don't have coverage. And, one of the things, of course, that I think would very quickly come up is charities that would provide insurance, because insurance is such a critical way of managing risk in healthcare and in so many other areas. But Canada is just about the only country in the world, other than I think North Korea does it, and I think there might be one other, that bans private insurance for publicly covered procedures. And that is disastrously inefficient. And it's cruel. And yet you can't get anybody, apparently, to say, oh, yeah, we should do that. Or, I mean, to take a similar example, but from education, and here in Ontario, where we have a conservative government, only we don't, there's all kinds of trouble in the healthcare system. You name it, they've got it. But they won't even think about vouchers. The idea that you would allow parents to get the same level of support if they go to a private option as people in the public system. And you have standards, the school's got to be a real school, but you allow parents to control the structure. And so now money follows the students to where the parents put them, instead of the students following the money to where bureaucrats and politicians put it. And yet nobody will do it. And it's so simple. It's so obvious. And every time there's some disaster in education, I'll tweet about it or post X about it and say, okay, anybody in favor of school vouchers? But in the political system, nobody is. And one of the paradoxes here is that if you listen to politicians talk, Canadians are the nicest people in the world. We are the kindest, most caring, blah, 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 blah. And yet, if you say, well, then why don't we rely upon Canadians through private voluntary charity to look after one another? They're like, are you crazy? There'd be corpses stacked up in the streets. So, and it's incoherent. Again, they could either say Canadians are mean-spirited, so the government has to beat them about the head and shoulders, shake their money out of their pockets and give it to the deserving, which they wouldn't do. Or you have to say, yes, Canadians really are nice. Let's have public policy driven by the idea that Canadians are nice. But instead, we say that they're nice and then base public policy on them being absolute finks. I mean, again, at one point in Ontario, when the Liberals were incumbents, and there was a suggestion from the Tories that we should allow more private schooling, and the Dalton McGuinty just tore his opponent to pieces over that, with the obvious implication that what you'll get is schools that teach bigotry, not math. But the preposterous thing is that a number of McGuinty's relatives worked in the parallel Catholic system. So it was appallingly hypocritical. It was low IQ, and it won him the election. But do we really think that if Canadians controlled the education of their kids, that they would see to it that they were inculcated in hateful stupidity? Or would they produce a system in which everybody, including, and I want to be clear on this, the teachers would be a lot happier? Because I say if you brought in vouchers, or call it charter schools, call it something else if vouchers give people hives, within 5 years, the teachers would be unable to believe that they'd ever tried to work in a system that resembled Canada Post. Right now, they can't imagine working any other way because public policy in this country, among other things, is terribly unimaginative. But give them 5 years where teachers get to do what they love, for parents who get to reward them for doing it well, and it would transform the landscape. And if you got rid of the Canada Health Act at the federal level, all they've got to do is get rid of it, say health is provincial. But at the provincial level, start by allowing private insurance for publicly covered services. So basic, so easy, so low risk. And yet people talk as though it would be the end of the world, and they never dare try it.
Yeah, I mean, the rich people already have that in healthcare, as you know. I have dozens of friends who went to the States to get their knee surgery or their hip surgery or even their heart surgery because they didn't like it was particularly heart surgery. They knew they would be dead if they before their turn came up for the heart surgery, so they would go to the States. So already have privately funded healthcare, but it's just you have to go to the States to get it. So what you're saying is let's do it here.
Yeah, and
Uh,
we have multiple tier healthcare because, of course, professional athletes jump the queue. People getting workers' compensation jump the queue. Politicians jump the queue. Like you think your MP or your MPP or your MLA or your MNA is waiting 8 months for a cataract operation? Not a chance. And so the smug hypocrisy, and that's another thing, I really find the smugness of Canadian public policy off putting. If they were doing a really good job, I would still urge them to consider that humility is reputed to be a virtue. But when they're doing a terrible job, when they're doing an unbelievably bad job, and they're so pleased with themselves about it, this is an infuriating way of doing things. And again, you go back to Alberta's alienation. One of the reasons why is that Central Canada isn't just muffing things; it's muffing them in the most conceited way imaginable. And I don't want to pick on some of the people that I know who go on panel shows on television and agree that only the Central Canadian perspective has anything to recommend it morally or mentally. But it really is tiresome to say, come off it, guys. You must know there are other possibilities. And even if they're bad possibilities, they deserve to be aired. They deserve to be assessed. They deserve to be taken apart. And for instance, Justin Trudeau told us we'd have maybe three small deficits and the budget would balance itself. Well, it didn't, did it? So we ought to be saying to ourselves, okay, what is it about budgets that tends to drive them out of balance? Why is so much of the Western world unable to live within its means at a governmental level? And I think the dynamics of it have to do with trying to put together winning voting coalitions by offering those people most likely to vote and most likely to vote for you more benefits than costs. And every year this gets harder and harder to do. There's a great book I read at a Liberty Fund conference years ago by Anthony DeJasse called The State, where he says it's like they're on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. And they can't slow it down. They don't dare jump off, but they know that at some point, when you're on a treadmill you can't keep up with, you're going to go flying off forwards or backwards with disastrous results. And that's where we are today. But we're never going to deal with it unless somebody somewhere says the government is too much in the business of giving away free stuff. That's really not a legitimate function of government. It isn't morally right and it isn't practical, so we should do it less. And you were talking about Alberta and how it was an NDP state. And one of the things about Alberta that makes me want to weep is that people lionize Ralph Klein because he came in and faced with a budget problem and he cut. And then he started to spend. As soon as the problem was dealt with, he started to spend. And by the time he left office, spending per capita was considerably higher than when he came in. He said you have to go hunting where the ducks are, but he didn't. He postponed certain kinds of spending, like on healthcare, at the cost of having demand increase. He didn't actually say the government's doing too much. And I used to go around asking people this. I remember at one point getting to ask a panel of, back then it was a reformer, an NDP, or a Tory, what is government doing that it just shouldn't? Never mind different level, never mind reorganize, it just shouldn't be doing it. And I think it was Jean Charest was then head of the Tories. He had nothing. Preston Manning reform, he had nothing. Only the NDP guy said there shouldn't be corporate subsidies. And then I actually got to ask this question of George W. Bush in person before he was President Bush. He was just running for the Republican nomination, and I somehow encountered him in a high school auditorium in New Hampshire while he was campaigning for the nomination. And I asked him this question, and he said, I'm not making this up, he said, that's a really good question. I'll have to get back to you on that. And he never did, of course. I wasn't expecting him to call me personally, but I was hoping he might think of something. But what's revealing, he wasn't yet president, but he'd been governor of Texas for 2 terms, and he couldn't think of anything the government was doing that it shouldn't be. And again, it's fine. We have people saying government should do more, government should add this, government should add that, pharmacare, etc. But why can't we ever talk about the possibility that government should do less? Think of something specific and have somebody somewhere in this federal system actually try not doing it and see what happened.
Yeah, that would be it would be amazing. It'd be an amazing challenge, wouldn't it? Like you say, if you maybe we could do that with like some of these student essays where we get students to write essays. Maybe we should be getting some of our younger minds to put their mind to things government shouldn't do. I think John, you and I both wasn't it the Justice Center where we used to
Yeah, the
judge
Justice Center
their
for
essays, but
Constitutional Freedom.
that would be a good question for some of our young minds someday. Is what do you think the government shouldn't do? But having said that, I mean, like like you say, most of them have lived their whole life and never given any thought to anything less. It's always more and more of this or that. But getting when we get talking about Western West, an independent Alberta, we get talking about basically the you know who gets what. And I mean, there's lots of people saying, well, I guess there's one thing that Quebec actually did for us was they asked the federal government to define the rules by which you can leave the country, which, as you know, is the Clarity Act. And as you know, it's 50% plus one. And now I hear, some people, even my dear friends, saying, well, something as important as leaving the country, it couldn't be 50% plus one, like it would have to be 60 or 65%. And I even heard one person saying, well, it wouldn't just be 50% or 60% of the people who voted. It would have to be 60% of all the people. So I did a little bit of work on it, and I think it was uh, I think it was 1992. The Liberals won with 42%. In '96, they won with 43%, and not in this last election, but the election before that, the Conservatives, the Liberals actually had 32%, and the Conservatives had 33%. But because the Liberals were the sitting government, they actually got to form the government by promising the NDP more as much of Alberta's money as they cared to take. And so when I do the math, it seems to me that Alberta has sent about $650 billion over the last 30 years, to the rest of Canada based on the support of a government that only had 42% support. So on the point of like what is the number that it takes to leave, I'm convinced it's 50% plus one. But I'm also convinced that, like, a lot of people say, well, what are you going to do about your share of the debt? Well, Jack Mintz, I think, has done a pretty good job of, showing quite conclusively that Alberta has sent about $630 billion net over the last 31 years to the rest of Canada. So I look at our $1.5 trillion debt and say, okay, like we'll pay our share of the debt. It's 150, 10% is 150 billion. We'll take it off of the 625 billion. So you only owe us 475 billion. Like I was 45 other, but I think the rest of Canada might as well use the fact that we don't feel like we owe, like we feel like we've more than paid our share of the debt. I realize, like, even though you haven't moved to Alberta yet, so you may not take that. I mean, like,
I don't know if it's me or you. I'm Your signal's breaking up a bit on me. On the assumption that people can hear me, I think that there's an argument to be made that if a country splits up, you go with the situation at the time of the separation, and people get their per capita share of the debt. But I also think, again, talking about having adult conversations, we ought at the very least to be able to say, here are the concerns, as there were with Quebec, right? Who gets the federal assets in the province? Uh, Here are the issues. Here are some positions on which reasonable people could disagree. Let's talk about it and see if we can figure out where approximately we ought to be. Because again, if Alberta decides to leave and they're much better off, they can carry that share of the debt. For one thing, they won't have to pay equalization anymore. But on this more fundamental question, can somebody leave a country? This is where my idea of fun is reading John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. I don't know, people who are familiar with John Locke may wonder whatever happened to the first treatise. Well, it's an extended demolition of the divine right of kings, which is not of much interest these days. But in the second treatise, he really starts from first principles and asks, why do we form governments? What are the fundamental rules? What can governments do? What can't they do? And he talks about this issue when you get to a really primal question, when you're in disagreement about what the rules are and even how to make them. He says you have to go with a majority vote. There's no other way that comes in with enough legitimacy. And so when you get to something like how do you leave a country when the Constitution doesn't specify it, then a majority vote gives you a mandate. And if Alberta got 50% plus one in favor of leaving, and Central Canadians, I'm not just thinking of Andrew Coyne, went, oh, no, no, you can't do that. Well, they would anyway. There's no way you couldn't stop it. So don't talk like children. Say, if a referendum were held and it produced a positive result, what would the subsequent steps be? How would they work? And then you can look at that and you can say to yourself, okay, we could both live with that. Or the rest of Canada could say, good grief, that'd be a disaster. Or Albertans could say, oh no, under those circumstances, we wouldn't want the deal. And then you'd have a more informed vote if you ever had one. And by the way, I did a draft constitution for Canada in a documentary that I did back in 2016, which, with a few changes as to what the federal regions are, I think would work for an independent Alberta or anywhere else. And one of the important points was here's how new places join. Because I think if Alberta were to separate, and I should say I don't want Alberta to separate, I want to fix Canada, partly on this problem that if Canada can't work, I don't think anything can work, although we're certainly doing our best to wreck it. But one of the things would be that if Alberta were to leave, certainly parts of British Columbia would be tempted to join, and so I think would Saskatchewan and possibly Manitoba. And if you leave with this constitution that has orderly procedures for coming in and going out, it makes it much easier to manage these questions. And again, I think maybe Ontario and Quebec would have to take the thing more seriously if they saw that Alberta had a rational, workable, constitutionally grounded, and in my case, Lockean scheme that had orderly procedures for other parts of the country also becoming part of this new venture. And again, if, for example, it turns out that the interior of BC and northern BC felt that they were alienated from Ottawa, then you would not be landlocked anymore. And that's an important consideration. But I think everybody should have this stuff prepared, and they should have it prepared not in a malicious spirit, but simply of saying, look, we do have a problem. A lot of people in Alberta are really unhappy. There is serious talk of separation. It may not yet be critical mass, but it's getting to that level that one or two more provocations could push it into the realm of winning a vote. So let's ask ourselves here and now, why is it happening? How would it play out if it did happen? What could we do to make it less likely? What could we do to make it more likely? I mean, one of the people are always going around in life thinking, how can I get better at this? How can I get better at that? And I treasure the title of a book. It was written back in the 1920s by a guy named Eugene Znosko-Borovsky, and I don't recommend that as a name. But the book was called How Not to Play Chess. And the reason he wrote that book with that title is he said, if you write a book telling people how to play chess like a world champion, it won't help most of them very much because they're never going to be that good. But if you write a book telling them, here are the basic mistakes that hold people back. Here are the kind of things that amateur players do that undermine their attempts to get better. And so I think there should be a book, How Not to Play Golf. There should be books on all kinds of things like that. And when it comes to Alberta separation, I think that people in central Canada should be thinking how not to keep Alberta in Canada. To ask themselves, what stupid things could we do that would drive the province out? And once we've identified them, let's not do them. And again, this
Yes,
would, I think, would be kind of grown-up approach.
I think that is a grown-up approach. And at one point in the last few months, Preston Manning was talking about creating another. As I've told you different times, and I've told most of the people that follow me. I actually went to the founding meeting of the Reform Party in Vancouver in 1986. And following that, we sent Preston Manning to Ottawa, saying the West wants in. Well, now 40 some years later, I said we're still on the doorstep of Confederation with our hat in our hands and their hands in our pockets, and now we want out. And Preston was just in the last 6 weeks, he was talking about having another meeting like Vancouver, where we talked about all the things that maybe the rest of Canada could offer Alberta, maybe more Senate seats, maybe more more MPs. Who knows what they were going to offer? And the suggestion I made through a friend to him, whether he took it or not, or maybe he just lost interest in the idea, but I said, like, Alberta is past thinking about things that we can do to fix it. But I mean, if somebody wants to fix Canada, like Preston Manning or someone should host another, Vancouver meeting in, let's just say, Sudbury, and say, like, what could we offer the West that would make this thing work? You know what I mean? I think it's fair to say that the people that I'm talking to, with the exception of you, are tired of talking about what will make it work. We want to talk about, okay, we're leaving. What are we going to do about it? You know what I mean? But I do think that what you're saying is an adult solution to a very, very serious problem, that somebody in the rest of Canada should be organized and say, look, let's take this thing seriously. Because if you see behind my head there's two books from Michael Wagner. And I mean, Michael Wagner has written several books on independence. The first one is, there's no other option, and his most recent book is called Time to Leave. But at one point he said, well, if Alberta if voted 50% plus one, that would be a good time to negotiate for a better deal. And I've been saying, no, if the rest of Canada wants to offer Alberta a better deal, they need to offer it before we vote, not after. You know what I mean? If we get 50% plus one, I think we will be planning to leave. So if someone wants to offer us a better deal, they should do it sooner rather than later. I don't think it's unfair to ask for that, is it?
I don't think so. And you bring up the Senate, and here's another interesting example, because when I did this constitutional documentary, and I was trying to figure out what would be a better way to have a Senate, because our Senate is obviously not well set up for it from any point of view. And I discovered that what the Australians do is quite ingenious. Now, I think there's an argument for us having senators elected by the provincial legislatures, which was the way it was originally done in the United States. You want provincial input at the federal level, you could do that. But there are other ways to do it, is have the senators elected. And in Australia, what happens if the House and the Senate deadlock, then they have a series of procedures. They have a couple of votes. And if that doesn't work, they both are dissolved and there's a new election. If they're still deadlocked, and this to me is genius, then they sit as one body and they vote, and the members of the House outnumber the members of the Senate. But also anybody can figure out what the vote's going to be. So it's never actually happened. But we could create a system where the Senate really does work. And I mention this partly because if Alberta were to separate, I would recommend they set up a bicameral system, and this is how they should do the Senate. It should represent the regions of the province, and they should use this Australian method, the so-called double dissolution, and then finally sitting as one body. But if you listen to constitutional debates in Canada, I promise you, will never hear anybody mention this. And I will bet you that 99% of the pundits yapping away until your ears hurt have never heard of it. And this to me is just, this is embarrassing. This is a really good way of having an upper house in a democratic system with responsible government, where the House, the elected lower house, controls the budget and thereby controls the executive, but the Senate isn't therefore reduced to meaninglessness. And so, again, one of the things, if you think about how to fix the Canadian Constitution, you also think about how to run things if Alberta separates. And if you think about how to run things if Alberta separates, you also think about how to fix the Canadian Constitution. I also drew up a Bill of Rights that didn't have loopholes, didn't have that infamous subject to the limitations that are demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. It just said you have the right to free speech, you have the right to freedom of religion, you have the right to bear arms, all these kinds of things, the right to property, not to have it taken without due process and so forth, which goes back to Magna Carta. So it's not too late, and it's constructive to think about how to govern an independent country, helps you think about how to reform Canada and vice versa. And it would be, in my view, a tragedy for us to blunder into Alberta separating without the rest of Canada having thought, what are we doing wrong that's contributing to this problem? And without people in Alberta having thought, how would we do it right if we left? Because sometimes people draft constitutions based on the pet peeves of those in the room, but a constitution has to have an organic unity. The parts have to work together, and that's not easy to do. The Westminster system does that. The American system was a genius by the American founding fathers to take all that was best about the British system and cast it into a new form that would be more durable. But the American founding fathers were intentionally using what they'd got from Britain, and they weren't starting from scratch, nothing of the sort. They were building on the foundations of Magna Carta. And so again, people should be thinking about that, and it would be good for everybody if we thought about these kind of things with or without reference to a possible secession crisis. But we don't. Again, Senate reform. I mean, I haven't never understood with reforms triple E how they ever thought it was going to work. And if you ask them questions, they just got mad at you. I mean, I really, Preston Manning, honestly, to me, was a big disappointment. I did work for the Reform Party at one point, and it was not a pleasure to try to discuss principles while they were devising policy. I'll be quite frank. They were just focused on public relations, and they weren't even good at it. And where are they now? Right? I'm still in Ottawa, and they're gone. Which goes to show, in my view, that if you think about your principles carefully, make sure you understand them, and then stand up for them, there's a place for that in the world. But time-serving, slippery opportunists are a dime a dozen, and they're barely worth that. So that's, again, I was saying earlier, but I'll say it again as we come to a close. If you're in public life, don't be obnoxious. Don't use it as an excuse to be unpleasant. Try to bring people in. Be a happy warrior, but stand up for what you believe in, so that when you're gone, they won't put on your tombstone, "I wish I'd said something." That's not the epitaph you want. You want to be remembered as somebody who knew what was right and stood up for it in a way that was, pleasant in suaviter in modo fortiter in re. Try to be pleasant in the way you do it, but be firm on the substance. And so often we get the exact opposite. We have politicians who are incredibly nasty in their manner, but absolutely feeble on the basic fundamentals. And we need more people to realize that you get one life and you should do something with it. That it was a line from The Lord of the Rings that I remember. I think I probably quoted it in some of our conferences. Let us make an end worthy of a song, even if there is none left to sing it. And you think to yourself, if people still made songs about people they admired, would your political career inspire a song or just a raspberry? My life, the classic political career. First you're sworn in and then act. Don't be that person, right? There's so much at stake here. And again, I think it would be a tragedy if we were to allow Canada to fall apart because we were not willing to fix bad policy. And if we're not, I understand that Alberta will have a legitimate case for separating and they may need to go. And maybe, Bruce Party has a point. Maybe that would scare the rest of Canada sober. But why not? Why not straighten up and fly right before it happens? Why not make this a better governed country? In my constitutional documentaries, I use this line that Canada was a country where the government could be small because the citizens were big. And I think it's not too late for that. We can still go back to a system where we give the citizens the right to speak freely, to defend themselves with weapons appropriate to that, to own property, to help their fellows through charity. So many ways in which Canadians are better than their governments think they are. And if we were to go back to that model, I think Alberta's grievances largely would be satisfied. And if we don't, I don't think they can be.
Just before I say, like, if anyone who's listening has any questions, you can just I think you can type them into the chat line and we can see them and we'll get John to answer them if there are any questions. But no, I think you're right. I mean, it's an interesting time. Bruce Party was speaking at something the other day, and he said, like, Alberta, this is your moment. Like, this is you've got a chance to change the course of history. And I mean, like, I think. Just the fact that we're having this discussion, and I don't know if you've ever heard of uh, what was the fellow we spoke at the other day? Armstrong was speaking at a function in I forget his first name, but he said he said he's sort of a world class prognosticator whose name just slips, Martin Armstrong, and but he said Alberta will be an independent country in the next few years because he said when you get to 30 and 35% support, he said it's like a forest fire; it creates its own draft. You know what I mean? And so, but anyway, time will tell. It's certainly an interesting time. We're certainly I think it's a good thing that we're talking about it. I'm glad that we're talking about it respectfully. You know what I mean? And just if there's any questions, we'll take them. If there aren't, I certainly appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, John. I think you sent me a copy of your constitution. We had some other people working on a draft constitution, and this is the time to be looking at these options and to be dealing with them so that we're ready when the time comes. And so we in Alberta will be taking a look at your draft constitution. We'll be looking at uh, a fellow by the name of Dale Wells had put together another. We did quite a bit of work on it here in Alberta, but again, like you say, a lot of it is. A lot of it is dealing with everybody's pet peeves, but on the other hand, like you say, the founding fathers, like they took the best of what the British system had, and they left out the stuff that was of no use to anyone. And so now we have an opportunity to at least discuss that. And so, but anyway, just so people know, like in 2 weeks from now, we're gonna try and do this every 2 weeks. I mean, John, you always say like there's no small meetings, and I mean our friend Todd Beasley had the Pathway Forward sort of a mini conference in Brooks in I think it was the end of April, and Corey Morgan spoke, Dennis Modry spoke, Vince Byfield spoke, myself, Todd Beasley, and Widener. But like I was talking to Todd today, like they've had 11,000 views of that afternoon conference. So I mean, people interested in these issues, and I appreciate you bringing perspective to to our first visit. And like I said, Bruce Party's going to be with us in a couple of weeks. In a month from now, Dennis Modry from Alberta Prosperity Project is with us. The Alberta Prosperity Project have they have the referendum question. I think it's been submitted to Elections Alberta, assuming that Elections agrees with the question. In a month, the Prosperity Project can start collecting the signatures to force them. So the clock is ticking. There's a lot of people.
Again, I'm not sure if the audience can hear Danny. I'm having trouble hearing him. In case he's frozen on your screens as well, I was wanted to quote something that somebody has often said to me, and I'm trying to think of the name. It was Danny somebody that a friend of his, their mother would often say, "There is no wrong time to do the right thing." And I hope that people will take that as a mantra for how to debate the issue, how to think about the issue, to say to ourselves, we face important
There we are. Oh, there we
responsibilities.
are. You're back. Maybe I was saying something that the Russians didn't agree with or something. I don't know, but
Well,
can
I
we
was
blame the
quoting you in your
Russians for
absence.
every? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you as I was quoting you in your absence.
Okay. Yes.
That there's no bad time to do the right thing.
No, yeah, isn't that the truth? Yeah, exactly. And so, anyway, we're trying to do the right thing. We're trying to have and we're trying to have an informed, respectful discussion. We're trying to involve, and we're trying to hear all sides of the story. You know what I mean? So, uh, I oh, it said, somebody said, what would a conservative leader have to do to get Eastern Canada to vote conservative?
Be
Uh,
conservative. Challenge the prevailing mindset and say, I know a lot of you don't agree with this stuff, but here's why you're wrong. Treat them with respect. And as George Washington once said, erect a standard to which the wise and the honest may repair. Because instead, what conservatives do is they run as liberals. And then people in central Canada look at them and say, even the conservatives think the liberals are right. We should vote liberal. Give them a real choice, show some respect, stand up for your ideas. Because when conservatives do that, they win big. Mulroney in
I,
84,
I,
Diefenbaker
I,
in 58.
Well, and Reagan, no, you're absolutely right, John, and I quote you on this quite often. People say, "Oh, we can't say that, or we won't get elected," and you always say, "Well, how do you know that? No one has tried it in 50 years." You know what I mean? And people ask me, when people ask me, like, "What are we going to do to get the youth involved in politics?" I say, "Well, we're going to tell them the truth." You know what I mean? We're going to tell them the truth because what happens is so often, like, I mean, you get some young people involved in an election campaign, and you go door knocking, and you say, "Oh, we believe in carbon net zero and we're going to we're going to save the environment by reducing the use of oil, and they think, oh, that's great. Now I'm a good young, conservative, and I'm out door knocking with whoever to save the environment. And then they get a job working in the oil industry, and they find out that actually the world needs more CO2. We would all starve to death or freeze to death, whichever came first, without the oil industry. And then they say, well, those lying shills of politicians, like, I'm done with them. I don't want anything to do with them. So why don't we just tell them the truth, and then and see what happens? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I
and
I
invite them to be part of an adventure. As
Yes,
my Magna Carta documentary says, the story of the preservation of liberty against long odds is a heroic, marvelous, highly improbable story, and now you're in it. So let's go. Let's have fun. Let's fight the good fight, and let's do something meaningful with our lives.
yeah, I agree. Let's yeah. Is it where's Frodo from? What is Frodo from Lord of the Rings? Is that where
Yeah,
he's from?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at one point you remember they're there and they're just desperate. He says, like, why are we doing this? Like, we should have turned back. Like, we could have turned back. And like, why didn't we? And he said, well, because the truth is, this is a fight worth fighting, and like, we're going to do it. So let's leave it at that, John. Like, I think it truly is. Oh, just wait. Have I got another question? Yeah. Well, yeah. I like the idea of, like, the conservative leader would have a lot better chance of getting elected if they actually campaigned as a conservative. And so, like, I mean, let's hope that we've inspired some young conservatives to campaign as conservatives in the future and try it. And truly, Bruce Party. We have some comments and questions. Do we have any more comments? No, I don't see any other questions. But like Bruce Party said, that like, this is an adventure. Like, me even talking about having a new constitution and maybe a new country, maybe not a new country. Uh, okay, what do you think the biggest challenge for the Albertans after the referendum? Uh, you want?
Well,
I have some thoughts on that, but you go ahead.
create a constitution that protects liberty instead of sending you down the same dreary path again on a smaller scale. And again, immodestly, I recommend my own, but I recommend my own because it's not something I thought of. It is an attempt to get the best of the British and American constitutions and tie it back to this long struggle for liberty, and which evolved organically. But one of the funny things about Parliament is we don't even know when the House of Commons began sitting separately, let alone where. But we know that they were by 1346, and by 1376 they were electing their own speaker. So this stuff has worked for hundreds and hundreds of years. So use it in such a way that you keep the government small. It does what it's got to do, and it doesn't start doing things it can't and shouldn't do. So to me, that's the big challenge, to establish liberty under law on a firm constitutional foundation, because otherwise you'll just get more of the same and it will all have been for nothing.
Yes, like, we don't want to do all the work and end up being the same old mix up, 10 or 20 years down the road. Let's leave it at that. I mean, it's been, I think we've had a great visit. I hope everybody could hear us. I think our sound did fade in and out a couple of times, but thank you for your time, John. As always, it's inspiring to listen to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
A pleasure to be here.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll be talking to Bruce Party 2 weeks from tonight. So thank you, everyone, and good night.